I've been sitting here for about an hour now, trying to figure out how to start this. I'm not sure I know how. My name is Harold. Harold Merritt. I'm 78 years old and I live alone in a house that used to have more noise in it than I can now remember clearly. The neighborhood has changed. The street looks different. Even the light through these windows feels different than it did when I first moved in here 40-some years ago. I'm not in any immediate danger. My heart is fine, the doctors say, or fine enough for a man my age. But there's something that happens to you when you cross a certain number of years. Something quiet. You start to feel the edge of things. Not in a frightening way. Exactly. More like you become aware of the shape of your life, the outline of it, and you can see where it ended, and where it didn't quite begin the way you thought it would. I'm recording this because I've been carrying something for a long time. Not a secret exactly. More like a truth I kept misunderstanding until it was mostly too late to do anything with it. I want to talk about being a man past 60 and trying to find someone to share a life with. Not because I have answers. I want to be clear about that right now. I have no answers. I'm not here to teach anybody anything. I'm 78 years old and I can barely figure out how to keep the kitchen clean the way Margaret used to. I'm not anybody's guide, but I have time behind me. A lot of it. And I spent a significant portion of that time getting things wrong. Quietly, privately, in ways I didn't fully understand until recently. So, this is just me talking. Before I have less opportunity to. Margaret was my wife. We were married for 31 years. She died in 2009, a Tuesday morning in February, cold outside, the way February gets when it has no intention of becoming March. She'd been sick for about 14 months before that, and I had been her caretaker. And I had told myself during those 14 months that when it was over, whatever that meant, I would figure out the rest of my life. I was 62 when she died. I remember thinking, in this strange, guilty, practical way that I couldn't stop, I remember thinking that I still had time, that 62 wasn't the end of anything, that other people had rebuilt their lives. My neighbor Bill had remarried at 65. I'd watched him do it. He seemed happy. He played golf on Saturdays again. He had someone to eat dinner with. I thought, quietly, in a place I didn't say out loud to anyone, I thought I'll be okay. I have time. That was 16 years ago. The first year after Margaret, I didn't do much of anything social. That felt appropriate, even necessary. I wasn't performing grief exactly, but I also wasn't pretending I was ready to be around people. I stayed close to home. I cooked badly. I watched too much television. I called my son Daniel on Sundays and we talked for 20 minutes about nothing in particular. I thought about Margaret constantly, not always in the ways you'd expect. Sometimes it was the practical things. She used to open all the mail. I hadn't realized she always opened all the mail until it started piling up on the table and I couldn't make myself touch it. She handled things. She tracked things. She knew when the car registration was due and where the good scissors were kept and which neighbor's dog had a tendency to get into the garden. I missed her in the small administrative ways first. and then the larger ones crept in later, which surprised me. I expected it to work the other way. By the second year, I started going out again, not to find anyone. I wasn't thinking about that yet. I just needed to be around other humans occasionally, or I was going to lose my mind in that house. There's a community center about a mile from here. My daughter-in-law, Paula, she suggested it. They have things in the afternoons. Cards, sometimes. A walking group. Coffee on Wednesday mornings. That is frankly terrible, but people show up for it anyway because the coffee isn't really the point. I started going to the Wednesday coffee, and that's where I first noticed something that I didn't have language for at the time, but I've thought about it many times since. There were women there. Widows mostly. A couple of divorced women. Women in their 60s and early 70s, a few a bit older. And I noticed, not in any predatory sense, I want to be careful about how I say this. I noticed that some of them seemed open, warm in that specific way, that a person is warm when they're not entirely closed off to the world. And I remember thinking, vaguely, from a safe distance in my own head, that this was the general vicinity of where something could potentially, someday, begin. And then I went home, and I watched television, and I thought about Margaret, and I did this for about 2 years. I'm telling you this slowly because it happened slowly. That's the honest way to tell it. Nobody warned me that the window doesn't stay open. Or maybe they did and I wasn't listening. Men, my generation, we weren't great listeners when it came to emotional things. We were taught, without being explicitly told, that the practical would sort itself out if you just kept showing up and being reliable. That love, or companionship, or whatever you want to call it, would find its way to you if you were patient enough and decent enough. I was patient. I was, I believe, fairly decent. That wasn't really the issue. There was a woman at the Wednesday coffee named Evelyn. I want to tell you about Evelyn. She was 68 when I first noticed her, which means I was about 64 or 65 at the time. She had gray hair, she wore short, and she laughed easily. Not loudly, not performatively, but easily. The way people laugh when something actually strikes them as funny, rather than when they're trying to seem pleasant. She'd been widowed too. Her husband, she told the group once, had been an electrician, had died of a heart attack at 61. She'd spent the years since becoming, as she put it, aggressively competent. Her words at everything she'd previously left to him. She'd learned to handle the finances. She'd had the roof replaced. She'd even, she said, learned to drive the riding mower. Everyone laughed. She smiled. And I remember thinking that she seemed like someone I might like to know better. I did not say anything to her for 7 months. No, I could tell you that I was grieving, and that would be partly true. I could tell you that I was uncertain, also partly true. I could tell you that I was afraid of what my children might think, or what Margaret's sister Barbara might think, or what the people at the Wednesday coffee might think if I showed any interest in anyone. All of that was there, swirling around, but underneath all of it was something I didn't fully understand at the time, something I'm only now, at 78, able to see clearly. I had spent my entire adult life, from about 22 onward, inside a marriage, I had no idea how to exist as someone who might want something from another person without the structure of already being in a relationship with them. Margaret and I had found each other young. We'd fumbled into it. I'd never really had to present myself, to stand in front of another person, someone I didn't already have a history with, and indicate that I was a person worth knowing. I had forgotten how. Or maybe I'd never fully learned. I eventually talked to Evelyn at a card table after the coffee one Wednesday about nothing important, something about a movie that had been on television the previous weekend. She'd seen it, I hadn't, and she described a scene that made it sound interesting, and I said I'd have to look for it. She said simply, "It's worth an evening." That was the whole conversation. Maybe 3 minutes? I drove home and I thought about it for the rest of the day, which, looking back, is both sweet and faintly ridiculous. I'm aware of that. Natural pause. The clock ticks. A breath. The months passed, the way they do. I got better at the Wednesday coffees. I talked more. I became, I think, a person that people were mildly glad to see. I brought decent pastries occasionally, which helped. I learnt people's names and their small histories. Dorothy's son was a teacher in Portland. Frank had a knee that was giving him trouble. Evelyn, I learnt slowly and in pieces, had a daughter in Atlanta and a garden she was very serious about, and an opinion about most things that she shared without apology and then let go of immediately, which I found striking. She wasn't attached to winning arguments. She just liked having them. We talked more. Not regularly, not intentionally, just at the natural rate at which you talk to someone you see once a week at a community center over terrible coffee. And somewhere in there, I want to be accurate about this, I'm trying to remember exactly, somewhere in there I understood that I liked her. Not in a vague, general way. In a specific, this particular person way, and I still didn't do anything. I told my son Daniel about her once, just mentioned her name. He said carefully, the way Daniel says things when he's trying not to push, he said, "Is she someone you'd want to spend more time with?" And I said, "I don't know." He left it there. I left it there. What I didn't understand then, and what I have thought about many, many times since, is this. Evelyn was also waiting. Not for me specifically. I don't want to overstate it. But she was, I came to understand much later, in that same territory. That same uncertain territory of being a person with a life behind her and some years still ahead, and no clear map for what those years were supposed to hold. We were both, in our separate ways, waiting for something to make it easier. It doesn't get easier. I know that now. The difficulty doesn't go away. The uncertainty doesn't go away. The fear of saying a thing and having the thing land wrong doesn't go away. You don't reach an age where any of that dissolves. I think I believed, somewhere, that I would eventually feel ready, feel confident enough, feel like the moment was obvious. The moment is never obvious. Evelyn stopped coming to the Wednesday coffee in the spring. I found out through Dorothy, who found out through someone else, that Evelyn had moved. Her daughter in Atlanta had been after her for years to come closer, and Evelyn had finally said yes. She'd sold the house with the garden she was serious about, and she'd moved to Georgia to be near her grandchildren. She hadn't made a big announcement about it. That was like her, I think, though I realize now I didn't know her well enough to say that with any certainty. She just quietly wasn't there one week, and then wasn't there the next, and then Dorothy told me. I sat in my car in the parking lot of the community center for a while after that, not because I was devastated. I want to be honest, I wasn't devastated in the way you'd be if you'd lost something solid. What I'd lost, if you can even call it that, was a possibility. A door that I'd been standing in front of for a year and a half, looking at, thinking about opening, and then one morning I looked up and the door was just gone. The wall was smooth where it had been. That's its own particular feeling. I don't know if there's a word for it. I want to tell you about the next few years honestly, because I think this is the part that matters most, and the part that's hardest to say. I retreated, not consciously, not with any kind of decision. I just gradually, slowly, the way water finds its level, I settled into the life of a person who was not looking for anything. I told myself I was content, and in some ways I was. I had my routines, the Wednesday coffee, though I went less often. Daniel's Sunday calls, my neighbor Jim's occasional invitations to watch football, which I accepted maybe 1 in 3 times. A book before bed most nights. A life. A quiet, organized, solitary life. And I was 68, and then 70, and then 73. At 73, I met a woman named Ruth at a dinner party that Daniel and Paula put together. Daniel had been quietly, patiently trying to include me in social things for years. I recognized what he was doing, and I was grateful for it, and I resisted it most of the time, and occasionally let myself be brought along. Ruth was Paula's colleague's mother. She was 71, recently retired, had moved from Cincinnati to be closer to her own family. She was taller than I expected, is the first thing I remember. She had reading glasses she kept pushing up her nose, even when she wasn't reading anything. We ended up seated next to each other, and we talked for most of the evening. She was interesting, genuinely interesting. She'd worked in hospital administration for 30 years. She talked about it without bragging and without false modesty, just reported it like someone giving you directions. She'd also, she mentioned, started taking painting classes since retiring, which she described as a committed relationship with failure. She laughed when she said it. I laughed too. At the end of the evening, Daniel caught my eye across the room with an expression I chose to ignore. Ruth and I exchanged phone numbers. That was Paula's doing, I think, though it was framed as mutual. We talked on the phone twice. Both times it was easy. She had an easy way of moving through a conversation, not filling every silence, letting things breathe. I noticed that. Margaret had been the same way. I hadn't been in a conversation like that in years, and I'd forgotten what it felt like, and it felt good. After the second call, I thought about asking if she'd want to have lunch sometime. I thought about it for 3 weeks. I know how that sounds. I know. 3 weeks is, by any reasonable measure, too long to think about asking someone to lunch. I understand that. I understood it then, partially. But there was something happening in my head that I'm going to try to describe accurately, because I think it's the thing I most wish I could explain to myself from back then. I was afraid of being pitied, not rejected exactly, though that too. But more specifically, I was afraid that Ruth would see me, this widowed old man calling to ask about lunch, and would feel something like sympathy. That she would say yes not because she wanted to, but because she was kind enough not to say no. That whatever came after would be marinated in that soft, uncomfortable pity. I couldn't bear that thought. It felt worse, somehow, than outright rejection. So I waited. And while I waited, I convinced myself I was just being thoughtful about timing, and the 3 weeks became a month, and I called her once more, a general call, friendly, no ask at the end. And then I waited some more, and Ruth, as it turned out, started seeing a man she'd met through her painting class. I found this out from Paula, gently, over a holiday dinner. Paula was careful with her face when she told me. She's good at that. I nodded and said that was wonderful for Ruth, and it probably was. I hope it was. Here is what I've come to understand, and I'm not saying it to instruct anyone. I'm saying it because it's what I know now and didn't then. The fear of being pitied is almost always a story you tell yourself, a very convincing one. So convincing that you can live inside it for years without noticing it's just a story. Ruth may well have felt nothing like pity. Ruth may have been sitting in her apartment after that second phone call thinking something she didn't say out loud. I'll never know. That's the weight of it. Not the dramatic tragedy of it, just the quiet, permanent not knowing. My friend Jim, the one with the football invitations, Jim lost his wife a few years before I lost Margaret. He remarried at 67. A woman named Carol, who he met at his church. They have a small house a few towns over now. I've had dinner with them twice. They are genuinely happy in the ordinary, unremarkable way that's easy to dismiss when you're watching it from the outside, but is actually quite rare. They bicker about small things. She rolls her eyes at his stories. He brings her tea without being asked. I watch them, and I don't feel envious exactly. I feel something more like recognition, like watching something I understand the grammar of, even if I'm not speaking the language. Jim told me once, years ago, when he was first seeing Carol, he told me that he'd asked her out within the first 2 weeks of meeting her. He said, I knew I didn't have years to waste deciding. I remember nodding when he said that. I went home and spent another year deciding. I want to stop here for a moment and say something plainly. I'm not telling this story because I'm miserable. I want to be clear about that. I'm 78 years old, and my life has been, in the large view, a fortunate one. I had 31 years with someone I loved. I have children who call me. I have a house and a body that still mostly cooperates, and enough years behind me that I can recognize what was good. But there is this thread in it, this quiet thread of waiting, of standing very still in front of things that required movement. And the reason I'm sitting here saying this into a recording device at 78 is that I think it cost me something real. Not everything, but something. 2 years ago, at a small dinner that one of Daniel's friends was hosting, I met a woman named Sylvia. She was 76, Italian. Originally, though she'd lived in this country for 50 years and had no detectable accent except occasionally on certain words, a music that surfaced briefly and then disappeared. She was a retired nurse, practical and warm, the way nurses often are. Not soft exactly, but not hard. She listened the way people do when they're actually listening, rather than waiting for their turn to talk. We talked for 4 hours at that dinner table. The other guests drifted away and came back and drifted away again. Sylvia and I sat there and talked about her years in a pediatric unit, and about Margaret's illness, and about the strange experience of visiting a city you lived in when you were young and finding it unrecognizable, and about her garden, and about regret. About regret, specifically. I don't know how we got there exactly, but we did. She said something I've thought about nearly every day since. She said, not as a dramatic statement, just as a matter of fact, the way she said most things, she said, I think the older I get, the more I can see that my loneliness was mostly optional, that I chose it by not choosing anything else. I looked at her across the table. She looked back. And something happened in that moment, some kind of quiet agreement between two people who had each spent too long being alone in their own ways. I'm going to tell you what happened with Sylvia, but before I do, I need to say one more thing about what it feels like to be a man of a certain age, looking at the possibility of closeness with another person. There's a specific, strange grief in it. Not the grief of missing Margaret, that's its own thing, a different country entirely. This is a grief for the version of yourself you expected to be. When I was 40, I had some picture in my mind of what my later years would look like. It involved, in some vague way, a person to have them with. That picture was never very specific, because Margaret was so thoroughly the person I was having my years with that there was no room in the picture for anyone else. And then she was gone, and I was left with this late-life version of myself that didn't match the picture I'd held for decades. And meeting someone new meant revising the picture entirely. Meant looking at who I was at 64, 70, 73, 76 men I didn't entirely recognize and asking, with some humility, whether any of these men were people worth spending time with. That's not self-pity. Or maybe it is, a little. But it's also just true. You carry yourself into every room, even when you'd rather set yourself down somewhere and walk in lighter. Sylvia and I had coffee the following week. She suggested it, actually. She sent a message through the friend who'd hosted the dinner old-fashioned, but she'd explained she wasn't comfortable with her phone, still used it mostly for calling people, and the host passed along her number with a note that said Sylvia had enjoyed talking with me and hoped we might do it again. I read that message twice. Then I called the number. She picked up on the second ring, which made me laugh in relief I didn't express. We arranged coffee for Thursday, a small bakery near her apartment. She got there before I did, had already ordered, was reading something on her phone with the reading glasses thing she did, pushing them up even when they weren't slipping. I sat down across from her, and for a minute we just breathed, looked at each other with the mild, comfortable recognition of two people who had already talked for 4 hours and didn't need to reintroduce themselves. "You look nervous," she said. "I am a little," I told her. She nodded. "Good," she said. "That's appropriate." And she smiled, and I laughed. And something in my chest that had been tight for a very long time was not quite so tight. We had coffee together 12 times over the next 3 months. I counted. I'm not entirely sure why I counted, except that each one felt significant in a way I didn't want to lose track of. We talked about everything and nothing. Her son, who was an engineer, my relationship with Daniel, which I was more honest about with her than I'd been with most people, the distance in it, the love in it, both. We talked about dying once, plainly, the way two people in their mid to late 70s can talk about dying without it being morbid because it's just there, in the room, a fact of the geography. She'd had a health scare 2 years before we met, heart-related. She was fine now, she said, or fine enough. She took her medications and walked every morning and had accepted, she told me, that her body was a building in its later maintenance cycle, requiring more upkeep with diminishing returns. I told her that was the most accurate description of being old I'd ever heard. She said she'd been working on it. I want to tell you what I got wrong this time, too, because I think it matters. Even with Sylvia, even after everything I just told you about Evelyn and Ruth and Jim and Carol and all the years of standing still even now, I was cautious in a way that cost us time. Not years. This time, months. But months count. When the math of your future is what it is at 76, there was a point, probably around the 3rd month, where I could feel that we had arrived at a threshold, that something needed to be said or named or moved toward. And I felt it, and I could tell she felt it, and we both stepped around it, politely, the way two people who've already been shaped by loss handle the edges of something new, carefully, too carefully. I was afraid still, of many of the same things, of presuming, of being wrong about what she wanted, of the look on a person's face when they have to gently redirect what you've offered. What I finally understood, only because Sylvia told me directly, because she was a more direct person than I am, and I am grateful for it. What I finally understood was this. She was afraid, too. Not of the same things exactly. She was afraid of becoming someone's caretaker again. Her late husband had been ill for years, the way Margaret had been ill, and she had tended to him, and loved him, and lost him, and she was afraid that what she had to offer now was a diminished version of herself, the version that had been used hard. We were both, in our different ways, holding back out of a kind of consideration that was actually getting in the way. She said it one Thursday morning, over the terrible coffee I kept arriving to find she'd already ordered. She said, "Harold, I think we're both being very respectful of each other in ways that aren't helping either of us." I was quiet for a moment. "Yes," I said. "So?" she said. "So?" I said, and we sat there with the whole weight of our respective lives and our respective fears and our respective ideas about what we deserved or didn't deserve, and then she pushed her glasses up her nose and looked at me and said, "I would like to spend more time with you, if that's something you want to." Just like that. Simple, direct, no ceremony. And I said yes. without 3 weeks of deliberation, without waiting to feel ready. Just yes. We were together for 8 months. Sylvia had a second cardiac event in October. She was hospitalized. It was serious. She spent 3 weeks in the hospital, and then she went to live with her son while she recovered, and in January she made the decision to stay there near him, which was the right decision, and I supported it, and we still talk on the phone. But we're not together in the way we were for those 8 months. And I'm not going to pretend there isn't grief in that. There is. There's grief in all of it, this late in a life. That's what I've learned. The grief doesn't mean you were wrong to try. The grief is just what love looks like at this distance from the beginning of things. What I want to say not as a lesson, just as the truth that's sitting in my chest right now at 78 years old. What I want to say is that I spent more than a decade after Margaret being very careful, treating the possibility of connection like something fragile I couldn't afford to drop. And in doing so, I dropped it anyway, many times, by holding it too tightly and too far from anything real. The 8 months with Sylvia were, I don't have the right word for it, significant. They were significant in a way that no amount of careful waiting could have prepared me for, and that I wouldn't trade for the comfort of having avoided the risk. She brought me soup once when I had a cold, left it on my doorstep in a container with a note that said, "This is from a recipe that is too old to have come from the internet." I kept the note. That's what I mean. That kind of thing. That ordinary, unrepeatable thing. I lost 16 years being careful. My granddaughter asked me once why I lived alone. She's 11, my granddaughter, Emma. She asks things the way children ask things, without the armor of tact, just straight at you. I told her I'd been unlucky with timing. She thought about that for a minute, the way she does, and then she said, "But you could still try, right? You're not that old." "I'm 78, I told her. She shrugged. Her grandmother Margaret was someone she'd never met, but she's heard the stories. She knows the shape of that history. "Still," she said, "I don't know if she's right. I don't know if there's another Evelyn, another Ruth, another Sylvia in the geography left available to me. I go to things. I talk to people. I've gotten better at saying what I mean in a more or less reasonable amount of time. Sylvia helped with that even at a distance. But I also don't have the same architecture of time that I had at 62, standing in the February cold outside the hospital, thinking I have time. I have some time. Whatever that means at 78. If you're somewhere in this story, if any part of what I've said has landed somewhere true in you, I'm not asking you to do anything with it. I told you at the beginning I wasn't here to teach, but I've been sitting alone in this house for a while now, and sometimes the walls ask you questions, and the only way to answer them is to say the thing out loud. This is me saying the thing out loud. The careful waiting, the closed doors, the mornings in parking lots not quite knowing what I'd lost, Evelyn's easy laugh, Ruth's painting classes, Sylvia's note on a soup container. All of it, the whole of it. I just needed it to exist somewhere outside of me. If you've carried something like this, something quiet that doesn't have a clean shape, I think you might understand what I've been trying to say. And if you want to sit with it a while, leave it in the comments below this video. I read them slowly because I type slowly, but I read them. There's something in knowing another person heard the thing you said. That's all. That's really all this was. Thank you for listening my story. If you want to share your experience, comment below to share a story with us. Thank you for your love and support. Kindly share, like, and subscribe my channel for more content like this. Take care. Goodbye.